I'm impressed by how quickly people can move on the stage during that little deal is 23 seconds long, and everybody moved. I find commercials interesting, fascinating. Like, I don't know, maybe you like this too. I always find it so interesting. You know, obviously around Super Bowl time, right? You're watching commercials and that kind of stuff, and you know that's when it gets a lot of play. But I'm so interested in watching commercials and sort of thinking about how they're trying to communicate their message, trying to get you to buy something, trying to stir a certain emotion or thought process in you related to whatever it is the commercial is about. I think they're so interesting. In thinking about this message this morning, I started thinking about candy commercials. And then I watched a bunch of them this week. And it was fascinating and hilarious. Like my favorite, I realized that there is a certain sort of genre of candy commercial, like a certain type of candy commercial that I find really interesting. Maybe you've seen a commercial like this. I watched a bunch of them. There were a ton like this. It begins with like a river of or like a pond or whatever of molten chocolate, right? You just see the chocolate, right? And it's flowing and it's brown. And meant to be, silky and delicious. And then like a piece of the chocolate drops into it in slow motion and splashes up. And then the voice announcer says a bunch of words to you like rich, chocolatey, decadent. And then you get a close, tight zoom on a person who is eating the piece of chocolate. And it's like they eat it and they close their eyes and it's like the most delicious thing they've ever had in their, like forget a week at the spa. You just need one of these little Godiva pieces and you are in. Like it's unbelievable. Like I found it really funny because I would watch, commercial. I watched a bunch, listen, I probably spent too much time watching these chocolate commercials, okay? But it was like, there was like this formula to them. And it was so fascinating because it became clear, like in these commercials, they're trying to stir an emotion in you, right? They're trying to poke at the idea of desire, that it's like, hey, I want this, I need this, I'm stressed out, I deserve this. It's like my own little mini vacation, right? And now everybody wants a piece of chocolate, right? Well, good news. No, I'm just kidding. I don't have any for you, but we do have delicious watermelon after the service. It's delicious, and let's be honest, it's better for all of us, right? Okay. So, but this idea of desire is something that is true for all of us. We all experience desires, wants, appetites, on one level or another, and that's fine. That's good, in fact. Many of the desires, the appetites, the wants that we experience are good things, gifts from God. These are not kind of bad things that we should close ourselves off to many of the desires that we feel for love and friendship and pleasure and intimacy and all of those things. Those are all good things, gifts from God. The problem, the place where it kind of gets a little weird is when we let our desire steer the ship, drive the car, set the direction, make the decisions, right? And let's be honest, we've all experienced this on one level or another, but it's probably a little more comfortable if I say it this way. We've all encountered people in our lives, right? We've known people who have allowed their appetites, their wants, their desires to sit in the driver's seat. They can be in the car. It's fine if they're in the car. They just can't drive. But the problem is when we let our appetites, our wants, our desires drive, set the course, make the decision, it can lead to all kinds of problems in all kinds of areas of life. It can lead to problems relationally. It can lead to problems spiritually. It can lead to problems with our health, our marriage, our career, all kinds of different things when we let our desire, which again is not a bad thing, it just shouldn't be driving, when we let it drive, right? And we've all experienced that on one level or another, and we've certainly experienced that with others. So what do we do with that? Or maybe a better question is, how do we protect ourselves from allowing our appetites, our wants, our desires to be in control, to be the deciders in our lives? How do we avoid the unfortunate consequences that often come when our desire goes unchecked? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. And we're going to do it by looking at an event between two brothers that is recorded for us in the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible. It's the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the first book of the Torah, all of those things. And so in the book of Genesis, Genesis just means beginnings, and we get a description of all of these different beginnings. One of those beginnings is the beginning of the nation of Israel. And so in the nation of Israel, we learn about the kind of the founders of the nation. They were called the patriarchs, and it began with a guy named Abraham. And God said to Abraham, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave your family, leave your country. I want you to go to this place that I'm going to show you. And Abraham does it. And then God gets him there, and God says, listen, I'm going to make two promises to you. One, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you and your descendants this land. It was the land of Canaan. This will be your home. And second, I'm going to give you descendants. I'm going to give you so many descendants, I'm actually going to make of you a great nation. And Abraham, do you know what he does? He believes God. He trusts God's promise. And God keeps his promise. God keeps his promise to Abraham. Abraham has a son who is named Isaac, and Isaac marries a woman named Rebekah. And they have two sons, twins, actually. The firstborn by just a couple of moments, is Esau, and then the secondborn is named Jacob. But when we talk about those three people, Abraham, Isaac, we don't say Abraham, Isaac, and Esau, who was the firstborn, who you would normally say he should be in that spot. We say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And why is that? You're like, well, Chris, I don't know why that is, and I don't know that I care why that is, but it's okay. This story sort of answers that question for us, and this story serves as a cautionary tale to help warn us, to help point us in a direction away from living a life where our desires, our appetites, our wants sit in the driver's seat of our life. So grab your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 25. Good news is, if you're using the Seatback Bible, it's on page 25. So page 25, Genesis 25, it's fantastic, right? It's like it was meant to be. And so we're going to begin by reading in verse 27. We're going to get a little bit of background on Jacob and Esau's relationship, sort of the family dynamic. So verse 27, look at what it says here. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Two brothers, one family, and a recipe for dysfunction. Because in this family, the parents were playing favorites. Isaac, the dad. Isaac had a favorite, his son Esau. Esau was sort of the stereotypical manly man. He was the hunter. He was the man of the field. Give me my weapon, and I'm going to go conquer. And he would come home. He would hunt. He would kill, and he would bring the dead animal home. And every time Esau came home from the field, there was a barbecue. And so Isaac loved it. He was like, this is fantastic. Look at my son. He comes home and the food's delicious and it's awesome. And Esau became his dad's favorite. And then there was Jacob, that wasn't his story. That wasn't his deal. The text describes Jacob as a quiet man who stayed among the tents. And so you must have imagined Jacob as someone who made himself useful at home. Maybe he got to spend a lot of time with his mom helping around the place and figuring things out. I'm sure he was smart and useful and he was able to do different things. And he and his mother spent a lot of time together. And Jacob became his mother's, Rebekah's, favorite. And you just imagine what that does to a family. You just imagine what that kind of, I'm dad's favorite, I'm mom's favorite, gosh, I wish that I could get dad's approval, but I know he just loves Esau, he just thinks Esau's the best. You just imagine what that does to a family relationship and to the relationship of these two brothers. Well, some of you don't have to imagine, because that's been your story. Some of you, it's like hearing this story surfaces past pain because you experienced some of that where you felt like, maybe I wasn't, I for some reason I just couldn't capture my dad's heart or my mom, or you longed for something that you didn't receive. And if that's you this morning, I just want to say how sorry I am for you that you experienced that's what you've had to walk through. But you should know this. There is a God in heaven. You have a heavenly Father who does not play favorites. You have a heavenly Father who loves you fully, completely. He accepts you, and you don't have to perform, and you don't have to earn his love. It is freely given. So if that's you this morning, I just want to invite you to run to your heavenly Father and be loved by him. But for Jacob and Esau, this created a complicated family dynamic that would persist in their family for a while. And it kind of becomes a little bit of the backdrop for the story that we're going to read next. Let's continue. Now let's get into the actual event. That's just a little bit of the backstory for them. Verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. That's an interesting little fact that the writer includes in there. The word Edom, so the descendants of Esau became the nation of Edom. That's what they were called. They were called the Edomites. And that word Edom has the idea of the color red to it. And so the writer of Genesis lets us know, hey, that's where that comes from. Jacob was cooking this red stew, and Esau wanted some of it, and so that's why you're all called the red people. So, it's going on there for us. But we see this kind of normal, ordinary encounter. Esau comes home from a day of hunting out in the field, and he is exhausted. He's hungry, and he's tired. Have you ever been there? You ever been hungry and tired? It's awful. He comes home, and maybe it was an unusually difficult day. We have no idea. The text doesn't tell us. But, maybe he wasn't as successful as he wanted to be. Maybe he got injured in the hunt, or maybe he didn't get lunch that day. We don't know. But whatever reason, today was difficult. He comes home, or it was just hard work. But whatever reason, Esau comes in the door, and he's wiped out. He's exhausted. He's hungry. He's tired. And he sees Jacob preparing dinner. And so he asks a relatively normal, reasonable thing. Hey, I would like some dinner, please. Can I have some stew and bread and the whole bit? And it's all perfectly reasonable. But before we go on to read Jacob's response, you should know this about Jacob. Jacob was a shady fellow. He was. I don't think the term con artist or grifter is unreasonable. in talking about Jacob. Jacob, for most of his adult life, this would be his story. It would be a game of how much can I get ahead? How much can I tell you the truth technically to get what I need, get what I want, get ahead? Jacob was the kind of man that you don't leave your valuables unattended when he's around. He wasn't trustworthy. And that would be his story for most of his adult life. Now, at the end, or toward the end of his life, God would get a hold of Jacob, and God would do a work in Jacob, and God would redeem those years and do a work. But for now, this is who Jacob is. And so look at how Jacob responds to his brother. And verse 31, Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." What? That's insane. That is crazy. Now, for us in the 21st century here in Burke, sitting here, the idea of a birthright, you figure out what it means. You have an idea when you hear that, what we're talking about, but it doesn't carry any emotional weight for us because that's not something that is kind of a part of the normal kind of conversation for us. But at this time, in this culture, this was an enormous deal. Let me tell you about the birthright, okay? The birthright, the son in the family who had the birthright is the firstborn, and Esau was the firstborn by moments. Like they were twins, but Esau was born first, and so Esau received the birthright. And what that meant, it gave him two primary advantages. One, the birthright gave Esau the right to lead the family once their father had died. So Esau would become the leader of the family. That's the first. And then second, Esau would receive a double portion of the inheritance. Now, what that means is when you think about an inheritance, right, if you're going to split the inheritance up among the kids, for instance, there are 4 kids, so you would split it up 4 ways. No. If there are 4 kids, you would split the inheritance, you would divide it by 5. And then the one with the birthright would get the 2 portions of the inheritance. That's how it worked. And so for Esau, this was about money. The birthright gave him money, and the birthright gave him power. He got to lead the family, and he received a double portion of the inheritance. This is a big deal. And you know what? There's not really, I was trying to think of this. Maybe you can think of a better equivalent. There's not really a good modern-day equivalent to this. I was trying to think of stuff, and if you think of a better one, let me know. Or if you're watching online, you can type your better idea in the comments. I'd love to read it. But the 2 things I thought of was, sign over the deed of your house to me. Or sign over your inheritance. When you ultimately get what's coming to you, you got to give that over to me. For lunch. For dinner, I guess is probably more realistic. But this was a bad deal. This was a terrible idea. Who in their right mind would say yes to such a ridiculous request? Wait for it. Let's keep going. Let's see what Esau says. Verse 32. Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright for me?" Esau. Really? You're about to die? It's like, I'm about to die. It's like, Esau, I know that maybe it was a difficult day. Maybe, you're coming to the field. You're hungry. You're tired. You know what you're like when you're hungry and tired. Do you remember there was a Snickers commercial, another candy commercial. There was a Snickers commercial, and it's like a bunch of friends playing flag football. You know this commercial, right? And it's like Betty White's out on the field, and they're going for it, and she's just being a jerk to everybody, and what's your problem? Nothing's my problem. And someone runs on the field and gives Betty White a Snickers bar, and then she eats it, and all of a sudden she becomes like a 22-year-old dude, and he's like, "Oh, I feel much better." And the tagline is, "You're not you when you're hungry." I told you I watched a lot of candy commercials this week. But here's the point. It's like when you're tired, when you're hungry, when you're exhausted, you don't make good decisions, do you? And Esau finds himself actually considering this ridiculous offer. And he says to himself, look, I'm about to die. What do I need this birthright? This thing won't help me if I'm about to pass out on the floor. I'm about to be dead. None of this is going to matter to me. And this is his thought process. Now, again, to be fair to Esau, he is in a compromised mental state. Certainly. He's tired, he's hungry, he's exhausted, and his shady brother is actively taking advantage of him. Right? That's happening too. But my goodness. But it's not so crazy. Because this is what happens. Maybe this is an extreme example. But this is what happens when we allow our desire to drive. When we allow our wants, our appetites, our desires to sit in the driver's seat, to call the shots, to choose the direction, we end up in situations like this. When our desire leads, we lose. And it's not good. And this points to kind of this big idea for this morning. This is what Esau is facing right now. And it's this. And this is the big idea for all of us. Don't allow what you currently want to rob you of what you ultimately want. Don't allow what you currently want, what you want right now, to steal from you what you want ultimately. What did Esau want? He wanted relief. He was exhausted. He was tired. It had been a long day. He wanted dinner. He wanted to feel better. He wanted dinner. But what he wanted right now was threatening to steal from him what he wanted ultimately. His birthright, the leadership of the family, all of his father's inheritance, all of those things. And this is the danger that we face when we let desire lead. So for all of us, don't put yourself in this position where what you currently want, don't allow what you currently want to rob you of what you ultimately want. We're going to talk more about this in just a minute, but let's see how Esau responds. Verse 33. Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. Lentil stew? There wasn't even like beef in there? Sorry. And he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Jacob says to Esau, "Hey, swear to me now." Isn't it true that our appetites, our desires, they always demand to be satisfied now, not later, don't they? It's always, I need it now. I want it now. Let's do this thing now. And so Esau, he makes the decision. He agrees to this terrible deal. And he sells his younger brother, Jacob, his birthright. He sells him the right to lead the family. He sells the double portion that he'll receive for a bowl of soup and some bread for dinner. And this would be a decision that Esau would later come to regret. And later in his life, Esau would come to hate his brother for what he had done to him here. But that's a story for another day. For us today, this whole story, it serves as a cautionary tale for us. It challenges us. It reminds us, don't make the decision Esau made. Because we face these kinds of decisions all the time. Don't allow in your life, don't allow what you currently want to rob you of what you ultimately want. Don't allow what you want right now, that thing that you're facing, that it seems so immediate, swear to me now. That thing that is it's right now. It's right in your face. Don't allow that to steal from you, to rob you of what you ultimately want. Well, how do we do that? I want to suggest three things to sort of help us as we process. It was like, looking back on Esau's story, we can, from our vantage point, we can see, gosh, this is ridiculous. Why would Esau agree to this? Why would Esau say yes to this? This is what happens when desire's in the driver's seat. Because you and I have made those kinds of decisions before. You and I, when we look back on those moments that we're ashamed of now, when we think back of those moments that are our biggest regrets, oftentimes, isn't this true? Oftentimes, that whole thing started with a desire left unchecked, with an appetite that demanded to be satisfied now, with a want that we allowed to sit in the driver's seat. And so we all have experienced this, and we will experience this. And so we got to be ready for this. So I want to suggest a couple things. I want to suggest three things, and I tried to find little words to represent each one of them to help kind of get it in our head. So here's our three-step process for doing this. So first, I want to challenge all of us. How do we guard against this? First, we decide. There's our first word. We need to decide what we ultimately want. And let me just talk about this for a minute and then maybe address a little caveat to this. But you and I need to decide what it is that we ultimately want. What I mean by that is when you think of your preferred future, when you imagine your future, what does it look like? What is it in your life that you ultimately want? And I want to give you some examples, and then I want to make a caveat, okay? So let me just give you some examples. So you might say, hey, when I think about my future, when I think about what it is I ultimately want, hey, I want to finish well with my husband, with my wife. I want us to get to the end of this thing. I want us to still like each other. I'd like us to love each other. I'd like it to still be fun. Maybe that's what you think of. Maybe that's what comes to mind. Maybe you think about your kids if you have kids. Maybe you think, hey, what I ultimately want, I want to get down the road and I want my kids to, when they're adults, I want my kids to want to be with me when they no longer have to be with me, right? I want my kids to still call. I'd like to be someone in my kids' life who they still look up to, who I still get a voice. They're still interested in what I think about different. Maybe that's what you think about. Maybe your head goes financial. Maybe you think, hey, when I think about my preferred future, when I think about what I ultimately want, I think about, hey, I'd like to not be living paycheck to paycheck. I'd like to have enough to be able to retire. I'd like to have enough to be able to give gifts to my kids. Maybe even I'd like to be in a position financially where I can support the work that God is doing in the world. Maybe when you think about your preferred future, that's where your head goes. Maybe you think, hey, my preferred future, when I think about what I want ultimately, I want to know God. I want to be close to God, intimate with God. I hear other Christians talk about this thing that God speaks to them, and I'm like, what is that? What does that even sound like? But I don't know what that means, but I want it. I'd like to have that kind of relationship with God where I know God and we're close and we're intimate and all these things. It could go a bunch of different directions. But think about, when you think about your preferred future, what does it look like? Decide what it is you ultimately want. Now, for some of you, I'm going to make you feel better now because you're hearing that and you're thinking, well, let me just put this caveat. Listen, if you're a Jesus follower, you need to know that God has something to say about your preferred future. If you're following Jesus, you need to know that God actually wants to speak into your future, your goals, that target on the wall, what you're aiming at. So when you think about your future, when you think about your preferred future, if you're following Jesus, God needs to be a part of the conversation. In fact, I would argue that God needs to lead the conversation. But regardless of where you are, if you're here and you're not following Jesus, listen, this is still good advice. Think about your future. When you think about your preferred future, what does that look like? So decide. You just need to decide. Hey, what am I aiming at? What am I pointing myself towards? What's the goal here? So decide. Second, reflect. And here's what I mean by that. So when you think about your preferred future, once you decide, hey, this is what I'm aiming at, you need to reflect. You need to take some time to think. And I think you need to reflect on this question. What do I currently want that's threatening to rob me of what I ultimately want? When I think about my preferred future, what is it that I currently want that's threatening to rob me of what I ultimately want? You may think, when you think about your preferred future, and you think in terms of, hey, I'd like to be out of debt, and I'd like to have a retirement, and I'd like to be able to give and serve and not work and maybe help support my kids or however that works. Like, I'd like to be financially in a place for that. That's what I ultimately want. But what you currently want, what I currently want is I would like to just keep spending and not pay attention to my credit card bills. I would like to purchase what's in my Amazon cart right now. I would like to go on this trip, and I know it's bigger than, it's like, what is it that you currently want that's threatening to rob you of what you ultimately want? For some of us, our spending habits are threatening to rob us of what we ultimately want. You may think, when you think about what you ultimately want, you think, oh, I want to finish well with my husband, with my wife. I want us to like each other. I want us to still be in love. I want it to be better than it is now. That's what I ultimately want. But what you currently want, this one gets touchy. But what you currently want might be threatening to rob you of what you ultimately want. That flirtation at the office, in your neighborhood, at the gym, I don't know, I could list other things, is potentially threatening to rob you of what you ultimately want. For some of you, your online habits, the things that you look at, that you watch, that you think nobody knows about, those things are threatening to rob you, to steal from you the thing that you ultimately want. That's your bowl of stew. What you want right now is threatening to rob you of what you ultimately want. Some of you say, hey, what I ultimately want, gosh, I want to be close to God. I want to know God's voice. I want to know His will. I want to be more like Christ. That's what I ultimately want. But what you currently want, I would like to keep binging shows on Netflix. I would like to continue sleeping in and not getting up and opening my Bible and spending time with God and His Word and in prayer. What you currently want is threatening to rob you of what you ultimately want. And so you need to decide. You need to think about your preferred future and you say, where am I heading with this? And you need to reflect, hey, when I think about my preferred future, when I think about what I ultimately want, what is it that maybe I currently want that's threatening to steal that future from me? And then last, you need to adjust. Seems simple enough. It's just that simple and just that difficult. But you need to make decisions. You need to decide, hey, what is it that I ultimately want? What is it in my life that's threatening to steal from me, to rob me of what I ultimately want? And then you need to begin pointing your life not at what you currently want, but at what you ultimately want. And so for some of us, that involves changing some habits. That involves confronting some unhealthy habits that we have. For some of us, that may mean having some difficult conversations and admitting some things that we'd prefer remain a secret. But you got to know, listen, our secrets make us sick. It's the truth. As long as you keep it hidden, it doesn't get better. It just festers, and it doesn't leave you. So if you think you're going to overcome it, On your own, you're not. You're not. You got to bring some somebodies in the mix. For some of us, right, the adjustment means, gosh, I need to set the alarm. I need to stop hitting snooze. I need to wake up and sit at the table and open my Bible and talk to him, and 100 other different things. But you get the point, right? It's like, how do we avoid this? We decide what we ultimately want. We choose a goal. We point to a direction. And remember, if we're following Jesus, God has a lot to say about our preferred future. So we need to let him be in the driver's seat. But we got to know, hey, what is it I ultimately want? And then reflect. What is it that I currently want that's threatening to rob me of what I ultimately want? And then we got to adjust. We got to make some new decisions. We got to set some new habits. For many of us, it means we need to talk to another human about what we're facing, about what it is that's threatening to steal from us our future. And it's one of those things, listen, you got to do it. Because here's the thing. When you think about your preferred future, I keep using that terminology, but when we think about the future, when we dream about, hey, that next season of life, it really is possible to head in that direction. But there really are things right now in your life that are threatening to steal that from you. So don't let it. Don't follow Esau's example. Rationalize, justify, make poor choices, and then sell your future for a bowl of soup. You don't have to do it. Decide, reflect, adjust. And if you do, you will be glad you did. And if you don't, you'll wish you had. But ultimately, the decision really is yours.